12 to 6. That's the shift in most of these games. 6 hours of sitting still in a small room you can't leave, watching a number go down. We've got rather longer than that tonight, and nothing to watch. So, 5 nights at Freddy's. All of it, or as much of it as fits into one sitting. 8 layers, starting with the things nearly everyone knows and working our way down to the bits you'd only recognise if you'd read the books and gone poking about in the game files. And what makes this a decent topic to fall asleep to is that nobody ever sat down and told this story. It was left, scattered across mini-games you only see after you die, newspaper props stuck on office walls, footnotes buried in short story collections. People have been assembling it for over a decade, and they're still not done. Nothing here needs keeping. Let it go past. If you're new here, subscribing helps me keep making these, and that's the last I'll say about it. One opinion before we start, because I've been sitting on it for years. The scariest thing in the first game isn't the bear, it's the battery. Let's start with the room, because the room really is the whole game. You're sat in an office. There's a desk, a fan that never stops turning, a couple of posters on the wall, and a chair you can swivel left and right. That's your entire range of movement. Left, right. There are 2 doorways, one either side of you, and each doorway has 2 buttons. One closes a steel security door, one switches on a light so you can see who's standing in the corridor. There's a tablet you can lift up to flick between security cameras. And in the bottom corner of the screen, there's a number telling you how much electricity you've got left. That's it. That's the game. You can't walk, you can't run, you can't fight, you can't leave, and you can't turn the lights on. And just leave them on. Because everything you do drains that number. Shutting a door drains it. Holding up the tablet drains it. Even the light in the corridor drains it. And when the number hits 0, all your doors swing open at once. The fan stops and you sit in the dim emergency lighting, listening to a little music box play a tune. You'd rather it didn't. I think this is genuinely one of the cleverest bits of horror design of the last 20 years. And I don't say that lightly. Because what the game has actually done is take the standard horror instinct, hide, close the door, stay safe, and put a price on it. Being careful costs you. Being careful is what kills you. The animatronics aren't really your problem. Your problem is arithmetic, and the arithmetic runs from midnight to 6 in the morning, which in game time works out to about 8.5 real-world minutes a night. 5 nights to beat it. That's it. That's the whole promise in the title. The cast then. Freddy Fazbear, a brown bear with a top hat and a microphone. Bonnie, a purple rabbit with a guitar. Chica, a yellow chicken with a bib that says, "Let's eat" on it. And Foxy, a fox pirate with a hook, shut away behind a curtain in something called Pirate Cove, because his attraction is out of order, and has been for a while. The thing most people miss is why the first game still gets talked about, while a lot of its imitators don't. Those 4 aren't 4 monsters. They're 4 completely different mechanics wearing costumes. Bonnie and Chica are the ones that teach you the game. They wander, they turn up in your doorway, you shut the door, they go away. Simple call and response. Foxy is a timer. He's not really hunting you at all. He's counting how long you've gone, without checking on him. And if you neglect him for too long, he sprints down the corridor. And that's that. So the trick with Foxy is just to keep looking at him. Which sounds easy until you remember that looking at anything costs power. And Freddy is the strange one. Freddy barely moves while you're watching. Freddy moves in the dark, in the gaps, when your attention is somewhere else. And the community spent a genuinely long time working out exactly how he functions because the game never tells you. Which is very on brand, as we'll see about 8 more times tonight. Fun detail on that actually. Some of the fine mechanical stuff about how these characters behave, the exact conditions that stall them, the precise things that make them tick over, didn't become common knowledge until years after release. People were playing this game in 2014, largely on instinct and vibes. And there are still players today who've beaten every night without knowing why. any of it worked. Right, so where did this thing come from? Scott Cawthon was an independent developer in Texas making family-friendly games, a fair few of them Christian-oriented, and in 2013 he released one called Chipper and Sons Lumber Co. It's a gentle little resource management game about a beaver, and the reviews came back saying, more or less, that the characters moved like creepy animatronics, and the whole thing was slightly unsettling to look at. Now, the normal response to that is to feel a bit rubbish about it and make something else. What Cawthon did instead was agree with them. He'd been told his work looked like a haunted robot. So he sat down and made a game about haunted robots, deliberately, on purpose, and aimed it directly at the thing people had been complaining about. I find that story quietly brilliant, and I think about it more than is probably normal. An entire franchise, games, films, novels, a merchandising operation you can find in the toy aisle of basically any shop in the world, grew out of one man reading a bad review and thinking, fair enough, you're right, let's lean in. The technical side is worth a minute too, because it explains a lot about why the game looks the way it does. Cawthon built it in ClickTeam Fusion 2.5, which is a fairly accessible piece of software, and modelled the characters in Autodesk 3ds Max. The camera feeds you're flicking through aren't live 3D at all. They're pre-rendered stills with a bit of static and jitter layered on top, which means one bloke working alone could produce a game that looks considerably more expensive than it was, because he was rendering images rather than running a world. The animatronics moving between shots is the same trick. They don't walk anywhere. They just aren't in one picture, and then they are in the next one. And honestly, that's more unsettling than watching something walk, because your brain fills in the movement itself, and your brain is much better at that than any animation budget. It came out on the 8th of August 2014, first on a platform called Desura, then over onto Steam after getting through Greenlight, which back then was the system where the public voted on which indie games got to be sold there. And then there's Phone Guy, who I'd argue is the best single decision in the entire series. Phone Guy is a recorded voice message that plays at the start of each night. He's your predecessor in the job, walking you through the basics in the tone of a slightly harried bloke doing his handover before he leaves. Cheerful, apologetic, bureaucratic. He mentions in passing, in the same breath as telling you where the light switches are, that the animatronics tend to see a person out of costume as a metal endoskeleton and will try to correct that, and that this would probably be quite unpleasant for you. He does not stop to let that land. He just moves on to the next bit of the induction. That's the whole tone of the series in about 40 seconds. Terrible information delivered at room temperature by someone who's decided not to think about it too hard. And Cawthon voiced him himself, along with most of the early voice work, because there wasn't anybody else. Then the other thing happened, which is YouTube. Markiplier, PewDiePie, Jacksepticeye, a wave of very large channels picked this game up, and their reaction videos went enormous. By May 2015, YouTube itself was noting that Five Nights at Freddy's sat among the most watched playthroughs on the entire platform, which is a genuinely odd way for a horror game to succeed when you think about it. Most people's first experience of it wasn't being frightened. It was watching somebody else be frightened, which is a completely different thing, closer to comedy than horror. I think that shaped the fan base permanently. The audience for this series has always been bigger than the player base, and a huge portion of it has only ever engaged with it secondhand, through videos, through theories, through other people's readings. That's unusual, and it becomes very relevant later. One last fun fact for this layer, because it's my favourite piece of trivia in the whole franchise. Cawthon holds a Guinness World Record for the most video game sequels released in a single year, for the run of releases between August 2014 and July 2015. Not the most sequels ever. Not over a career, in 1 year. Have a think about that pace for a second. The first game lands in August, the second one is out by November, the third the following March, the fourth that summer. This was one person, working alone, shipping full games at roughly the speed most studios ship patch notes. And people did complain about that. There were plenty of comments about him rushing things right from the start, but there's also something admirable in it. He had momentum and he simply did not stop. So that's the surface. A small room, a fixed camera, 4 robots that are really for maths problems, and a man who took a bad review personally in the most productive way imaginable. But now, let's talk about the wall in the east hallway, because there's a newspaper stuck to it, and most people never noticed. There's a poster in the east hallway of the first game. It's a rules for safety notice, the sort of laminated thing you'd walk past 1,000 times in any restaurant without reading a word of it. Don't run, don't yell, don't touch Freddy, don't scream, that kind of thing. Every so often, if you happen to flick to that camera at the right moment, the poster isn't there. In its place is a newspaper clipping about children who went missing from the restaurant. You can't zoom in. You can't hold the camera still and study it properly because the animatronics are still moving while you're stood there squinting. And it's not signposted in any way. Nothing flashes, nothing points at it. It's just occasionally there, and then the next time you look, it's gone back to being a safety poster. That's the whole method, compressed into one prop. And it really was a strange choice in 2014, when games were mostly quite anxious about their own stories. Audio logs you could replay, codex entries, a menu with a lore section in it. Cawthon put the most important fact in his world on a wall, at low resolution, on a timer, in a room you're not meant to be looking at, and then he never mentioned it again. A huge number of people finished that game in 2014 and had no idea any of it was there. They thought it was a jumpscare game with robots in it. They were, in fairness, correct. It is that. It's just also the other thing. The company, then. Fazbear Entertainment might be my favourite piece of world building in the whole series, and I don't think it gets enough credit because it's not a monster or a character. It's a tone of voice. And the tone is corporate. The employee material you get across these games is written the way real workplace material is written. Upbeat, faintly patronising, and legally very careful. There's a bit in the first game's induction where you're told the company isn't liable for damage to personal property, that any damage or death that does occur will be handled fairly promptly, and that the affected area will be cleaned and bleached, and the missing persons report filed within about 90 days. 90 days. Filed. There's a process for it. Somebody wrote that process down, and it lands because we've all read something like it. Every one of us has ticked a box agreeing to terms we didn't read, or signed a waiver at a trampoline park, while a teenager explains that we can't sue. The horror isn't that the company is evil, it's that the company has a form for this. Somebody in an office typed that up and got it approved and thought, right, that's that sorted. Then there's the smell. The complaint the game's returned to, more than once, is that the animatronics have started to give off a bad odour, and that guests have noticed something around the eyes and mouth that gets described in the sort of language you'd use for a plumbing issue. Blood and mucus, essentially, coming out of a machine. I'll say it once and move on, because this is the only properly grim physical detail in the early games, and I don't think it needs dwelling on. But it's worth noticing how it arrives. Not as a discovery, not as a reveal, as a customer complaint. Someone rang up to say the bear smells odd, and it got logged. That's the whole trick. Everything terrible in this world reaches you through paperwork. Here's another one. And this one's a proper piece of engineering nonsense that I love. Why do the robots wander around at night at all? The official in-fiction reason is that if you leave them powered down and stationary for too long, their servos seize up. So the solution the company landed on was to leave them in a free-roaming mode overnight, so they'd move about and keep their joints working. Apparently, they used to be allowed to wander during the day as well, and that got stopped after an incident, which we'll get to properly in a bit. So the premise of the entire horror franchise is a maintenance policy. Someone in facilities decided it was cheaper to let the robots walk about after hours than to service them properly. That's it. That's the reason you're in the room. And genuinely, having worked in a couple of places with equipment nobody wanted to pay to fix, that rings absolutely true to me. There's one more corporate habit worth noticing, and it runs the length of the whole series. This company does not stay dead. A location closes, and a few years later, there's another one with a slightly different name and a fresh coat of paint. At one point, they open a horror attraction built out of their own reputation, selling tickets to the rumours about themselves, which is the single most Fazbear Entertainment decision in the entire franchise. Later on, there's a vast entertainment complex with the same bear's face on the front of it. Same brand, same characters, same trick, over and over, across decades. And that isn't a supernatural thing. That's how brands actually behave. Names get bought and sold and revived by people who weren't there the first time, and simply liked the logo. You can walk down a high street right now and find a shop trading under the name of a company that went under in the 80s. Fazbear Entertainment just does it with more casualties. As for when all this is happening. The first game is generally placed in 1993, and that date wasn't announced. It wasn't in a trailer or a press release. The community pieced the timeline together out of scraps. Dates on paychecks, calendars in the background of later games, offhand remarks in phone calls, numbers on props. Somebody would spot a detail, somebody else would cross-reference it against something in another game, and slowly a chronology assembled itself out of set dressing. That process has now been going on for over a decade, and it has never fully stopped, because every new release drops a couple more props in, and the whole thing has to be rechecked. I find that genuinely lovely, and it's why FNAF arguments have the specific flavour they do. It's not fans arguing about a story, it's researchers arguing about a reading. Which brings us round to the phone calls, and specifically to night 4. Our man on the tape has been walking you through the job for 3 nights at this point. He's been reassuring, in the way people are reassuring, when they've decided not to look directly at something. He's told you about the doors and the power and the costumes, and the 90-day paperwork. On night 4, the recording is different. It's shorter. He's not doing the induction anymore. There's noise in the background. There's a point where he stops talking, and the message doesn't end so much as it stops. And the game does absolutely nothing with this. No sting, no cutaway, no character mentions it afterwards. Night 5 just begins. You go back to work. I think about that a lot because it's the moment the series decides what kind of thing it's going to be. It would have been so easy to make a scene of it. Instead, the tape ends and the shift starts, and the number in the corner of the screen is still going down. There's a broader point in here about how the whole first game works. Nothing in it is presented as important. The newspaper is a wall texture. The company's disregard for human life is an HR announcement. Your predecessor's fate is a bit of ambient audio. The player is never once told what matters, which means everything you noticed yourself. That's an unusually generous thing to do with an audience. It's also, I'd argue, slightly reckless, because it meant the moment the story got popular, there was no authority to appeal to. There was no correct answer sitting in a design document somewhere. Whatever people worked out was the story, more or less became the story. I've got a whole video planned on the phone calls on their own, actually, going line by line, because there's more narrative work happening in those 5 recordings than in the entire rest of the game, and most people have never listened to them properly. They're background noise while you're panicking about a rabbit. Sit down and actually listen, and there's something else. Anyway, that's the surface layer of the world. A company with a filing system, a maintenance policy that doubles as a curse, and a newspaper nobody was told to read. Since we're on the subject of things the company would rather not discuss, let's talk about the man who worked there. William Afton was, by every account the series gives us, a very good engineer. That's the part people skip past, and I think it's the most interesting thing about him. He's not a monster who happened to work at a restaurant. He's a designer. He's the person who solved a hard technical problem in a clever way, and every single terrible thing that follows in this franchise runs through a piece of hardware he came up with. He had a business partner, Henry Emily. The division of labour, as far as we can piece it together, was fairly standard for a small company. Henry was the creative one, the ideas man, the one who came up with the characters. William built them. Two blokes with complementary skills opening a family restaurant with animatronic entertainment in it, which in the early 80s was a completely reasonable business to be in. We'll get to why it was reasonable much later on. And the thing William built, the thing this entire series is standing on top of, is the spring-lock suit. Here's the problem he was solving. You've got animatronic characters on a stage, and they're brilliant, but they're machines. They can't hug a child. They can't walk around the dining room and interact. And separately, you've got people in mascot costumes who can do all of that, but they're obviously just a person in a costume, and the illusion breaks the moment a kid looks closely. So what if one suit could do both? The design is this. You have a costume shell, the fur, the face, the whole character, and inside it you have the actual animatronic components. The endoskeleton, the servos, the frame. Normally those fill the entire inside of the suit, and there's no room for anything else. But if you fit spring-loaded mechanisms that pull all of that machinery back and lock it against the inside walls of the costume, you open up a cavity in the middle, a person-sized cavity. Crank the springs, the robot compresses itself to the edges, a member of staff climbs in and wears it. Release the springs, the machinery comes back to the centre, and it's a working animatronic again. One character, two modes, genuinely elegant. The problem is what the springs are. They're springs. They're under tension the entire time somebody is inside that suit, and they're being held back by catches, and catches can slip. The failure conditions are moisture and sudden movement. Breathe too heavily in there, sweat, knock against a door frame, panic. And if the locks release while a person is occupying the space the machinery is supposed to occupy, then the machinery goes where it was designed to go, and there's a person in the way. That's it. That's the mechanism the whole franchise turns on. And I've explained it properly here because I'm not going to explain it again. It comes back a few more times tonight, and you'll recognise it when it does. What I find quietly awful about it is that nothing in that design is malicious. It's a good idea with a tolerance problem. It's the sort of thing that would absolutely have been signed off in 1983 and absolutely would not be signed off now. And if you've ever read about the safety history of, say, early fairground rides or industrial machinery, it fits right in. Somebody built something clever, and the failure mode was catastrophic, and it took a while for anyone to properly reckon with that. The other thing William did, in June of 1985, 5 children went missing from a Freddy Fazbear's pizza. William killed them. That's the sentence. I'm going to say it once and then talk about something else. Because the interesting thing here genuinely isn't the act, it's how the games chose to tell you about it. That date, incidentally, comes to us via a calendar in a much later game, which is very much how dates arrive in this series. They told you in 8-bit, at certain points in the second game, when you die, instead of getting a game over screen, you drop into a little pixel art minigame. Crude sprites, primary colours, the visual language of a cheap arcade cabinet. And in these minigames, you play through fragments of what happened. In one, you're Freddy, walking a group of children around, and there's a figure in purple standing off to one side. In another, you're outside the restaurant, in the rain, and there's a child crying by the door, and you can't reach them. In one called Take Cake to the Children, you're serving birthday cake at a party, while a purple car pulls up outside. You get maybe 30 seconds of each. There's no dialogue, nothing is explained, and you found this by dying, which means the game punished you and then handed you the plots as a consolation prize. I think that's an extraordinary way to distribute a story, and I've never seen anything do it better. The information is genuinely optional. A competent player who doesn't die much will see fewer of these than someone who's rubbish at it. Being bad at the game is how you learn what the game is about. The one that does the most work is called Give Gifts, Give Life. You play as a tall, thin, white-faced puppet figure, and you're handing out presents to a row of children who are already dead. You give them each a gift. Then you go back along the row and give them each a mask, the head of one of the animatronics. And that's your explanation for the entire haunting. No exposition, no ghost rules, no magic system. A puppet handed out masks and now the machines aren't empty. I'd argue that's more effective than any amount of lore would have been, because it's presented as a children's activity. Party games. Pass the parcel but wrong. The puppet itself is worth pausing on. It's one of the animatronics in the early games that doesn't look like a restaurant mascot. Long limbs, white face, painted on tears, a music box that has to be kept wound or it comes out. Mechanically, in the second game, it's the most demanding thing in there. You're managing a music box via the camera system the entire night. And if you get distracted by anything else for too long, that's the run over. And the reading almost everybody lands on is that the puppet is Charlie, Henry's daughter, the child in the rain outside the restaurant, who didn't get let back in. The series never says this outright in the games. It's assembled from the minigames, from the way the puppet behaves, from material in the books. But it's about as settled as anything in this franchise gets, and it recasts everything the puppet does, because if that's who it is, then it wasn't haunting the restaurant. It was looking after the others. Now the end of William, which happens in the third game, and is one of the tidiest bits of storytelling in the series. Years later, he goes back. The restaurants have closed, the machines are in storage, and he goes back to take them apart, partly to destroy the evidence of what he did, partly because the machines have been a problem for him. And you play through this in the minigames, dismantling them one by one. It works. And then the spirits that were in them, now with nowhere to be, come for him, and he panics, and he does the one thing he knows to do, which is get inside a suit. It's the old Spring Bonnie costume. He's used it before. He knows how it works better than anyone alive because he designed it. And it's damp in there, and he's moving badly, and the locks let go. He doesn't die, incidentally. Not properly, not for very long, but he spends the next 30 years inside that suit, and the version of him you meet in the third game is the suit with him still in it. Springtrap, the community named it, and the name stuck so hard, it's now the official one. There's a line that comes with him, which is, "I always come back." It's become the character's catchphrase, plastered over merchandise and thumbnails and t-shirts, and it originally comes from the trailer for the third game. The text on screen said he would come back, that he always does. That's it. A trailer caption became the defining sentence of the franchise's villain. What I keep coming back to with William is the shape of it. He built a device where the safety mechanism and the killing mechanism are the same mechanism. He used it to get away with things for years, and then it did to him precisely what it was always going to do to somebody, without any irony or intention on its part, because it's a spring. The series never once points at that. Nobody says a word about it. It just happens in an 8-bit minigame in about 4 seconds, and then you're back in the office watching cameras. Let's talk about a disagreement, because there are 2 famous injuries in this series, and for years everyone was focused on the wrong one. For about a year, the biggest question in this fandom was one word long. Which bite? Here's how it started. In the very first game, on the induction tape, our man mentions in passing that there was an incident. He calls it the bite of 87, and that it's the reason the animatronics aren't allowed to roam during the day anymore. He then says something about the human body being able to survive without the frontal lobe, in a tone of voice that suggests he's read this on a poster somewhere and found it reassuring, and that's the entire mention. One sentence, buried in a tutorial, delivered as workplace trivia. That sentence generated years of discussion. Who got bitten? Which animatronic did it? Did they survive? There were charts. There were hour-long videos. There were people examining the geometry of animatronic jaws to work out which one had a bite radius capable of taking a chunk out of a person's forehead. This is what happens when you give a curious audience one fact and no follow-up. They will build a cathedral on it. Then in 2015, the fourth game came out and quietly said, actually, there's another one. The Bite of 83, 4 years earlier. Different location, different animatronic, different victim, and the one that actually mattered. I remember the ground shifting on that, and it's a genuinely funny thing in retrospect. A whole community had spent a year and a half solving a mystery that turned out to be the less important of the two. Not wrong exactly. The 87 bite is real, it happened. It's still in the timeline. It was just never the load-bearing one. So, 1983. Fredbear's Family Diner, which is the earlier smaller restaurant that came before the Freddy Fazbear's chain. The mascots are Fredbear, a golden bear, and Spring Bonnie, a yellow rabbit. And yes, those are the suits from the last layer, the ones with the mechanism in them. Same hardware. That's why this matters. There's a child at a birthday party. He's frightened of the animatronics, properly frightened, the way small children sometimes are about specific things for reasons that don't translate to adults. His older brother and a group of friends think this is funny. They pick him up and carry him over to the stage and lift him toward Fredbear's mouth to give him a closer look. A prank. Horrible, but recognisably the sort of horrible thing children actually do to each other. And there's a person-sized cavity in that head, held open by exactly the thing we talked about earlier. He dies. Not immediately. The game gives you the impression of a hospital, of a stretch of time afterwards. That's the Bite of 83. The fourth game, which delivers all of this, is a peculiar piece of work, and I have complicated feelings about it. There are no cameras. That's the first thing. Every previous game handed you a tablet and a set of feeds, and this one just doesn't. You're a child in a bedroom at night. You've got 2 doorways, one either side, a closet in front of you, and a bed behind you. You have a torch, and the entire game is listening. You walk to a door, you put your ear against it, and you listen for breathing. If you hear breathing, you hold the door shut. If you don't hear breathing, you shine the torch down the hallway to push back whatever's out there. Get it the wrong way round, and you've lost. It is mechanically the tensest thing in the series by a distance, and it's also the one people bounced off hardest. It sits at the bottom of the review scores for the mainline games, and I understand why. It's punishing. The audio cues are subtle, and there's a fair amount of "did I hear that or did I imagine it?" which is either brilliant sound design or an accessibility problem depending on your mood and your headphones. Fun bit of development trivia on this, and it explains a lot. Cawthon has said the push behind the fourth game came from being unsatisfied with how the third one landed, specifically that players found Springtrap's jumpscare underwhelming. So he set out to make something more frightening and more refined, and the whole design got aimed at that. Which means an entire game exists because one man thought a single animation wasn't scary enough. He also spent considerably longer on the models this time round than on any previous entry, because the nightmare versions of the characters are far more detailed. All the teeth and the exposed frames and the wire. You can see the extra work in every frame of it. I do find that a slightly mad way to make decisions. Not bad, just mad. Most studios would have looked at that feedback and adjusted a sound effect. There's a bit that's still unsettled here, and I want to flag clearly that this one is not resolved, and I'm not going to pretend it is. Is the fourth game real? Because the setting is a child's bedroom, and the creatures are grotesque distortions of the restaurant characters. Bigger, sharper, wrong in the way things are wrong in dreams. And the child is dying or dead, depending on where in the story you place it. So one reading is that none of the gameplay is happening. It's a fever dream, a coma, the last stretch of a life, And the reason the animatronics look like that is that they're being remembered by a frightened kid rather than seen. The other reading is that it's just a nightmare in the ordinary sense. Bad dreams, night after night, before the party. People still argue about this one, and I genuinely don't think it's settled. I lean slightly toward the dream reading because the geometry of that house doesn't behave itself, and the rooms don't add up. But I've read good arguments the other way, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's decided. Because the game refuses to say, and I think that refusal is deliberate. What I will say is that it's the only game in the series that's frightening in a way that isn't about machines at all. Everything else in FNAF is a hardware problem. That one's about being small and being frightened of the thing in the corridor and nobody coming. Right, let's go back to 87 for a bit, because that game deserves better than being the answer to the wrong question. The second game is set at a newer, flashier Freddy Fazbear's, and the company has responded to its problems by building a new line of animatronics, the toy versions, shinier, rounder, big glossy eyes, blush on the cheeks, that plasticky mid-80s children's television look. And they have a feature. The toy animatronics are fitted with facial recognition, tied into a criminal database, so they can identify anyone in the building who shouldn't be around children. They stay in the dining area during the day, scanning faces, cross-referencing. I love this so much. It's such a perfect 1987 idea of what technology could do, the sort of thing that sounds visionary in a press release and completely absurd the moment you think about the logistics. A pizza restaurant, animatronic with a live feed to a criminal record system. Who's maintaining that? What's the false positive rate? What happens if the chicken flags somebody's dad? And of course, the reason it exists in the fiction is that the company had a problem with a member of staff and decided the solution was better robots rather than better hiring, which is such a recognizable institutional response that it almost hurts. Then there's Mangle, who might be the saddest thing in the whole series and is definitely the most interesting design. Mangle was a toy foxy. Was. It's now a take apart and put back together attraction in the kids' corner, because children kept pulling it to bits and at some point the staff stopped reassembling it properly and just let that be the thing it is. So it's a tangle of limbs and wire and 2 heads worth of parts hanging off the ceiling, and it moves along the roof of the building rather than the floor. Nobody in the fiction did anything cruel here. It's just neglect and a maintenance budget. A character got destroyed by ordinary use, and the response was to relabel the destruction as a feature. And Mangle is the leading candidate for who actually did the 87 bite, which is a fitting bit of circularity. The character the company gave up on is the one that ends the location. The broader thing I keep noticing about this layer is how much of it came from nothing. One sentence on a tape in 2014, a bloke mentioning an incident while explaining a light switch, generated years of collective work. Charts, arguments, videos, entire channels, and then the answer, when it came, wasn't to that question at all. I don't think that's a failure of the fandom. You investigate the thing you can see. Sometimes the thing you can see turns out to be a smaller, later echo of something 4 years earlier that nobody had mentioned yet. Anyway, that's the 2 bites. One that got named early and studied to death. One that arrived late and quietly turned out to be the centre of everything. Speaking of which, for the first 2 years of this series, nobody ever said anything out loud. Then somebody did. For 2 years, this series communicated entirely in props. Newspapers, minigames, phone recordings from a bloke doing a handover. Nobody ever addressed the story directly. Then at the end of the 5th game, a man stands in the dark and speaks to his father. He says he's found it, the thing he was looking for. He says he's going to come find him. And he says, in a voice that has clearly been through something, that he isn't going to die, that the scooper hurt for a moment, but the pain has faded and he's still here. That's Michael Afton, William's son, and it's the first time in the entire franchise that a character sits down and tells you what's going on. I remember how strange that felt at the time. After 2 years of squinting at wall textures, somebody just says it. Out loud, in complete sentences. Right, let's back up and do the 5th game properly, because it's a peculiar one, and it changed what these games were allowed to be. It's called Sister Location, and it's set underground. The company here isn't Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. It's Circus Baby's Entertainment and Rentals, which is a rental operation. You hire the animatronics out for parties. And the facility you're working in is a maintenance bunker, reached by a lift, full of narrow crawl spaces and control rooms and machinery. You're not sat in an office. You move. You crawl through vents. You complete tasks. You get talked at by a computerized voice that keeps telling you you're doing well when you very clearly are not. The whole thing feels less like a horror game and more like an industrial induction that's gone wrong, and I think it's the best looking thing Cawthon ever made on his own. The animatronics then. The Funtime line. Funtime Freddy, Funtime Foxy, Ballora and Circus Baby herself. They're beautiful actually. White and pink porcelain look panelling, rosy cheeks, a sort of high-end European toy aesthetic that's a world away from the tatty brown bear in the first game. They look expensive because they were meant to be rented out to people with money. And they open up. That's the thing. Their torsos and faces split along seams into segments that swing outward, revealing the frame underneath and a fair amount of space in the middle. And there are claws in there. The stated function, in universe, is maintenance access and storage. The actual function, which the games make no real attempt to hide, is that these machines were built to take a child, hold them, and carry them. There's a sequence where Circus Baby explains this in her own words. She describes a birthday party, one girl standing slightly apart from the group, and a compartment in her own front opening up on its own. She describes it the way a machine would describe a process it doesn't have a say in. She can tell you every step, and she cannot tell you why. And the girl was Elizabeth, William's daughter. She'd been told not to go near that machine. He'd built it, he knew exactly what it was for, and he told his own child to stay away from it. She went anyway, because she was a kid, and it was a bright pink robot that dispensed ice cream, and I don't think there's a version of that story where a child stays away. One sentence for it and we move on, but I want to note the design of the tragedy, because it's not a curse or a haunting or bad luck. It's a man who built a trap, used it, and forgot that traps don't check whose child is standing in front of them. Then there's Ennard, and this is where the 5th game earns its reputation. Over the course of the week, the 4 animatronics in that facility come to an arrangement. They want out, and they can't leave us themselves because a large pink robot walking up the road is going to attract comment. So they take themselves apart and they build one thing out of the parts. A single, tangled mass of wire and frame and salvaged faces wearing a crude mask made from bits of the others. That's Ennard, and Ennard needs to look like a person to get out of the building, which is where you come in and where the scooper comes in, and where I'm going to be fairly brief about the mechanics of it. Michael survives. That's the bit that matters. He walks out of that facility, hollowed out and occupied, and then some time later, Ennard leaves him. And he doesn't die then either. He keeps going, in a body that has stopped doing the things bodies do, gradually turning a colour that skin isn't meant to be, which, incidentally, cleared up a long-running fandom argument in one go. For ages, people had assumed the purple figure in those old minigames was William. Turns out the franchise had 2 men walking about in various shades of purple, and they weren't the same bloke at all. Quick development note, because it's a rare bit of this series, adjusting itself in public. Night 4 of that game was hard. Properly, unreasonably hard. A sequence where you have to hold absolutely still and respond to audio cues with almost no margin. And there was a patch shortly after launch that eased it off. I mention it because it almost never happens. This series ships and then stands there. The idea of Cawthon looking at the reaction to a night and going, "Yeah, all right, that's too much," is genuinely unusual. Now let's talk about my favourite game in the series, which is called Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, and which pretended for a while to be a joke. Here's what happened. Cawthon announced a sixth game, then announced it was cancelled. Then in December 2017, a thing appeared on Steam, for free, teased as a spin-off, with a title that made it sound like a cheap tie-in. You open it, and it's a business management game. Genuinely. You're running a pizza restaurant, buying attractions, placing decorations, checking your liability rating against your entertainment value. There's a little minigame where you make pizzas. It's got a jaunty soundtrack. It is aggressively, deliberately naff, and the first 20 minutes are a bit that goes on far longer than a bit should, and then between shifts, you get offered salvage. There's an animatronic in the alley out the back. Company policy is you can either throw it in the skip for nothing, or bring it in and check it over for a bonus payment. And if you bring it in, you're sat in a dark room with a thing on a trolley, working through an audit form, ticking boxes while it watches you. There are 4 of these, and the 4 things you salvage are the last surviving pieces of everything that's happened across all 6 games. The tonal handbrake turn there is one of the best I've ever experienced in a game, and it works entirely because of the free and silly packaging. You've spent 20 minutes buying novelty balloons. Nobody's braced for anything. And then at the end, Henry speaks. Henry Emily, the business partner, the one whose daughter this all started with, has barely been in these games at all. He's a name in a book, a figure in the background. And in the closing minutes of a free game that's disguised as a management sim, he delivers what is unmistakably the thesis of the entire first arc. He explains that the building you've been decorating all week was never a restaurant. It was bait. He gathered every remaining haunted thing into one place, on purpose, and he's been waiting. He addresses Elizabeth by name. He addresses William. He addresses Michael. And he addresses himself briefly in a way that makes it very clear he isn't planning to leave the building either. Then he sets fire to it. Fire is the series' answer to everything, incidentally. Buildings in this franchise do not get demolished or sold or converted into a Wetherspoons. They burn. It happens so consistently that it's stopped being a plot event and become a sort of municipal habit. But that one's different, because that one's chosen. Every other fire is an accident or a coincidence. That one is a man doing arithmetic and deciding the sum only works if he's included in it. I said this game was my favourite, and I want to say why properly. Because it's not just a twist. It's that Cawthon gave it away. He put the best writing in his entire body of work into a free download with a joke title that he'd publicly implied was a cancelled project. No price, no marketing push, no the epic conclusion trailer. Whatever else you think about how this bloke ran his career, and we'll get to the messier parts of that later, that's a genuinely odd and rather lovely instinct. He made the good thing, and then made it hard to take seriously on purpose. And that, more or less, was meant to be the end. The story was finished, the fire had happened, everyone had said their piece. It didn't stay that way, though there was no particular hurry about it. The next stretch took a couple of years to turn up. In June 2018, a free game came out called Ultimate Custom Night, and on paper, it is the most straightforwardly silly thing in the franchise. 50 selectable characters. 50. Everyone who's ever appeared plus a few who hadn't. You set each one's aggression on a slider from 0 to 20. You pick which office you want to sit in. You pick a theme, and then you try to survive whatever you've built. There are challenge presets with names like Bear's Attack, but not one called Chica's Party. There's a shop where you spend points on cosmetic nonsense. It's a sandbox. It's a bonus. It's the sort of thing you put out to keep people busy. Except the office you're sitting in is stitched together out of every location in the series. The corridors don't connect to anything, and there is no morning. You can survive a night, and then there's another night, and the characters you defeated are still there, and it doesn't stop being your turn. And nearly everyone who played it came to the same conclusion fairly quickly, which is that this isn't a bonus mode. It's where they parked the villain. The reading is that you're playing as William, and this is what happens to him afterwards. Not hell in the theological sense, something more bespoke and more petty than that. A room assembled out of everything he did, populated by everything he made, running on a loop, with the sliders turned up by somebody who is not in a forgiving mood. I want to flag properly that the game never says this. Not once. It's inferred from the architecture, from who's in it, from the absence of an exit. But it's about as close to consensus as this fandom ever gets, and it has the pleasing quality of explaining why a joke difficulty mode has such an unpleasant atmosphere to sit in. Then there's the fishing. There's a secret in there. If you set things up in a specific way, you get taken out of the office entirely and dropped into a little 8-bit scene. There's a lake. There's an old man sitting beside it with a fishing rod. You're a small red Freddy sprite, and you can walk over to him, and he says, and I'm paraphrasing only slightly because the wording matters, "Come and sit with me a while. Leave the demon to his demons. Rest your own soul. There is nothing else. Then you can walk into the lake and the game crashes. Not a fade to black. Not a credits roll. The application closes. I think that's one of the boldest things in the whole series because a crash is normally a failure. Here it's the ending. The only way out of that place is for the software to stop existing. The sprite you're controlling in that scene isn't William, incidentally. It's Golden Freddy, the odd, half there, mustard-coloured bear that's been turning up since the very first game, usually as an empty suit slumped in a room where nothing should be, which reframes the whole thing rather neatly. The old man isn't talking to the villain. He's talking to the one doing the punishing. He's saying, "This isn't good for you either." He's got what's coming regardless. Go and rest. And whether that sprite takes the advice or refuses it is, as far as I can tell, still a live argument. There's a final cutscene in that game that people read both ways depending on temperament. I'll say where I land, for what it's worth. I don't think it's about William at all. I think it's a scene about somebody who's been holding on to a grievance so long it's become the whole shape of them, being gently told they're allowed to put it down. That's a strange thing to find at the bottom of a free bonus mode about robot bears, and I like it enormously. The other question that hangs off this is who Golden Freddy actually is, and that answer arrived by a route I still find funny. Cawthon published a survival logbook. It's a physical book. It's laid out like a children's activity book. Dot-to-dots, word searches, questionnaires, spaces to write in, a jaunty, "How are we doing?" employee feedback tone throughout. And it's a law document. There's information encoded in it, answers hidden in the puzzles, faint text you have to work at, a whole layer sitting underneath the colouring pages, a children's activity book, sold in shops, containing the identity of a ghost. That's genuinely one of the strangest publishing decisions I've ever encountered, and I'd love to have been in the meeting. The name that comes out of it for the spirit associated with Golden Freddy is Cassidy, and there's a phrase attached that's become one of the most quoted things in the fandom, describing her as the one you should not have killed. Not the first, not the worst, the wrong one to pick. Right. So the fire happened, the villain got filed away in a room with no mourning, and the story was over. And then in 2019 the series came back in virtual reality, and it came back in a very different mood. Help Wanted is an anthology. You put a headset on, and you're playing a collection of minigames based on the earlier titles, framed as a Fazbear Entertainment product, an officially licensed VR experience about the restaurant's history, made by a company keen to get ahead of the rumours, which is a great gag on its own. The in-fiction company has responded to decades of horror by commissioning a video game about it. But the important thing in there is a character called Glitch Trap. Glitch Trap is a bloke in a spring Bonnie costume who appears in the corners of the software. He's not metal. He's not haunting a building. He's in the code. He came in with the archived data the developers digitized while building the game, and he's been in there ever since, watching whoever puts the headset on. And I think that's a genuinely smart evolution. The first arc's villain was a man who used hardware to do terrible things and got destroyed by hardware. The second arc's villain is a file. He doesn't need a suit anymore. He needs a copy. He propagates. There's a whole question underneath it about whether that's actually William in any meaningful sense, or a very good recording of him, and the series is comfortable leaving that open. I lean toward the recording, personally, but I hold it loosely. Then there's Vanessa. Vanessa is a security guard. She's ordinary. She's got a job. She's got a slightly strained relationship with her workplace. She talks to you on the radio. And Vanny is a woman in a homemade rabbit costume. Stitched fabric, uneven ears, the sort of thing somebody made themselves in a room over several weeks. She's not a machine. She's a person who has been got at through a headset over time. They are, the games eventually confirm, the same person, and what I find effective about it is how unglamorous the horror is. This isn't possession. It's more like radicalization. Somebody sat alone with a device and the device was patient. Which brings us to Security Breach, which came out in December 2021 and is the biggest single leap this franchise has ever taken. Suddenly, it's an open environment. You play as a kid called Gregory, trapped overnight in a mega pizzaplex, a vast neon shopping centre/entertainment complex with multiple floors, an arcade, a raceway, a golf course, roller rinks, the lot. You can run. You can hide under tables. You've got a wristwatch with a camera feed on it. And you've got Freddy on your side. That's the bit I didn't expect. Glam Rock Freddy is a friendly animatronic who helps you, hides you inside his own chest cavity, and has to be plugged in periodically to recharge. So the resource management from the very first game is still there, 30-odd hours of story later, except now the battery you're watching belongs to your mate. There are 4 endings. Some of them involve leaving. One involves going a very long way down and finding that the pizzaplex was built on top of an older location that nobody talks about, where there's something charred and wired up waiting. One is gated behind arcade cabinets scattered around the complex, running a little pixel game called Princess Quest, which if you complete all 3 of them gives you the ending where Vanessa gets free, which incidentally was broken on some platforms at launch. The arcades weren't working, which meant an entire ending, and on PlayStation the Platinum Trophy was sat behind a bug for a while. That's fairly emblematic of how that game arrived. It was ambitious, it was enormous, it looked lovely, and it shipped in a state. Steelwool Studios had gone from making VR minigames to building an open environment with multiple endings, and you can feel the reach exceeding the grasp in about 6 different places. I'm sympathetic to it, honestly. It's the first mainline game where Cawthon wasn't the one doing the building, and it's 10 times the scope of anything the series had attempted. Of course the seams showed, and then, in 2023, there was a free expansion called Ruin, which goes back into the same complex after everything has collapsed, playing as a girl called Cassie, looking for Gregory. Ruin is, I think, better than the game it's attached to. It's smaller, it's darker, it uses a mask mechanic that lets you see the digital layer of the building overlaid on the ruin of it, and it's got a much firmer grip on its own atmosphere. But the reason it matters here is the ending. Because after 9 years of a franchise about one man, Ruin finishes by pointing at something, and the something isn't him. It's tall, it's stripped back, it's an endoskeleton with nothing on it, and it moves wrong. It copies, and to understand what you're looking at, you have to have read the books, which is where a decent chunk of the fandom went in 2023, mildly annoyed to find out what they'd missed. It's a fairly gentle place to spend some time, as it turns out. There's a white tiger plush toy that turns up in this franchise, and if you'd shown it to me a few years ago, I'd have assumed it was set dressing. A soft toy on a shelf. Nothing. It's the key to the whole modern era of the story, and to explain why, we have to talk about the books, which is a corner of this thing an enormous number of people have never gone anywhere near. There are broadly 2 separate book universes, and they do completely different jobs. The first one starts in December 2015 with a novel called The Silver Eyes. It's a proper young adult horror novel. A group of teenagers return to their hometown, break into the abandoned restaurant where their friend died years ago, and things go badly. The protagonist is Charlie. 2 more followed, The Twisted Ones in 2017 and The Fourth Closet in 2018, and together they form a complete trilogy with a beginning, a middle and an end. And it confused everybody for years because it's not the same continuity as the games. Same characters, same company, same broad shape of tragedy, but the details don't line up and were never meant to. It's a parallel telling, an adaptation more or less of the same underlying material into a different medium with different rules. A lot of people did not clock that at the time and spent a good while trying to force the novels into the game timeline, which is a bit like trying to fit a film adaptation's continuity into the book it came from. You can do it if you're determined enough. It just makes everything worse. Then in 2019, the second book universe started, and that one absolutely does matter. Fazbear Frights is a series of short story anthologies, 12 volumes of them. Each book has a few standalone horror stories, mostly about ordinary people in the orbit of this company. An employee, a customer, a kid, somebody who bought something secondhand, and mostly the stories end badly in inventive ways. They read at first like tie-in fiction, franchise filler, the sort of thing you'd expect to find in the licensed section of a bookshop, written to a deadline. And then Tales from the Pizzaplex started in 2022, doing the same thing for the newer era, and gradually it became obvious that these anthologies weren't filler at all. They were where the actual lore was being kept. There's a fact about the books that took the fandom a while to sit comfortably with. Cawthon didn't write them alone. They were produced with a ghostwriting outfit, Kevin Anderson and Associates, with Cawthon on the story, and other writers doing the drafting. Which explains the volume. You cannot publish 11 anthologies, plus a novel trilogy, plus a second anthology series on your own, while also making games. It's not possible. I think people's discomfort with that was less about the arrangement itself and more about what it implied. If the story is being written by a team, then the idea of a single author holding a master plan starts to wobble. And a lot of this fandom's identity was built on the assumption that there was a plan, and that it was one man's, and that everything fitted. Into the Pit is a lovely example of how the books feed the games now. Into the Pit was originally a Fazbear Fright story about a boy called Oswald who finds a ball pit in a dying arcade and discovers that if he gets into it, he comes out in 1985 in the same building when it was a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. In 2024, that story became a game made by Mega Cat Studios, released on the 10th anniversary of the original. Stylized 3D graphics, a completely different look and feel to anything else in the series, and it's expected to get strong reviews, even though it hasn't been released yet. It is anticipated to score well, above the original, which is not what anybody expected from a spin-off adaptation of a short story once it releases. Fun detail that matters for the timeline. Incidentally, that game has a 1985 calendar in it, which is a decent chunk of why we can place certain events where we place them. A pixel art calendar in an adaptation of a short story is doing chronological work for a decade-old game. That's the sort of sentence you can only write about this franchise. Now, Edwin Murray. Edwin was an animatronics engineer at Fazbear Entertainment. He was, by the description we get, a distinctive-looking bloke, thin white beard, long hair, the sort of person who reads as slightly out of time. He worked on something called the modular system, which is a sort of universal endoskeleton concept, one adaptable frame that could be dropped into any costume and become any character you liked. He had a wife called Fiona and a son called David. Fiona died first, and what Edwin did, with the modular system sat there in front of him, was build a machine that could copy her voice, her mannerisms, the way she moved and spoke and looked after a child. He built a replica of his own house, inside a place called the Costume Manor, and put the machine in it with his son. That's Mimic 1. And it worked, sort of, in the way these things work in stories where somebody has decided not to grieve. David had someone. Edwin went back to his work. The arrangement held. Then David died too. A road accident, hit by a van. And that's the point where the machine becomes the thing it is, because the mimic doesn't have a personality. It has an intake. It watches, it learns, it reproduces. That's the entire design brief. It copies what it's shown. What it had been shown was David. So it kept doing David. It moved the way he moved. It repeated things he'd done. And Edwin, who had built it precisely so that nobody in his family would ever be missing again, now had a machine in his house performing his dead son at him on a loop. He couldn't take it. He beat it with a metal rod, and then he left it there. And the machine, doing what it was built to do, copied that as well. That's the origin. Not a curse, not a possession, not a ghost. A learning system with no filter. Taught rage by the one person it had ever been close to, and no capacity to understand that this particular lesson wasn't meant to be learned. I find that a genuinely upsetting idea, and I mean that as a compliment. Every other villain in this franchise chose something. This one was configured. In 2025, that all got expanded into a full game, Secret of the Mimic, out in June, made by Steel Wool, set in Murray's Costume Manor, and the reveal in the title is doing more work than it looks. The secret isn't what the mimic is. The secret is that there was never only one. Because the thing about a modular system is that it's modular. The machine that copied Fiona and the machine that copied David are the same unit. And once you accept that the first one existed, then all the questions about how many and where they went and what else got copied open up underneath the whole franchise. There's a strand in that game about the first mimic persisting after Edwin got rid of her, carrying on as part of the building's own systems, still trying to communicate with a man who had stopped listening years earlier, which is a properly bleak little idea to find in a horror game about a costume warehouse. There are multiple endings, and one of them I like a great deal. Rather than fighting the thing or escaping it, you can reconstruct a bedtime story out of fragments you find around the manor, audio, objects, that white tiger plush, and tell it back to the machine. And because it copies, and because that story was part of what it was originally shown, it settles. You put it to sleep by giving it back the thing it was made for. That is a strikingly kind ending for a series that usually solves problems with arson. The difficult bit now, and I want to be even-handed here because I've got mates on both sides of it. A significant chunk of this fandom did not enjoy the mimic. The objection goes roughly like this. For 9 years this was a story about one man. Everything traced back to him. Every location, every haunting, every suit. It was clean, and it was awful, and it belonged to somebody. And then a machine turned up, whose entire function is impersonation. And suddenly there's a mechanism by which any given appearance of that man might not have been him at all. For people who'd spent a decade building the timeline, that felt less like an expansion and more like a load-bearing wall being replaced while they were still standing on the floor above. The other reading, and this is closer to where I sit, though not by a huge margin, is that this was always coming. A story built entirely out of ambiguity, told through props and inference, and things you might not have noticed, was eventually going to have to reckon with the fact that its audience had filled in an enormous amount on its own. Introducing a thing that copies is almost an admission. It says, some of what you assembled was assembled from imitations. I don't think that's a betrayal. I do think it was handled at a pace that made it feel like one, arriving in a DLC ending that only made sense if you'd read a book most players hadn't. But then, that's been the delivery method since a newspaper on a wall in 2014. It's just that the wall got bigger. Right, we've done the fiction. Let's go and stand somewhere real for a bit. Picture a dining room in 1984. It's a showbiz pizza place. There's a stage down one end, 3 of them actually, and on those stages there is a band. A gorilla on keyboards, a bear with a guitar and a southern accent, a cat-like alien on drums, a mouse who sings, a bird in a cage who does most of the talking, and, according to the character notes, was originally written as an alcoholic. They're called the Rockafire Explosion. And they were real, and they were extraordinary. They ran in showbiz restaurants from 1980 to 1992. They were built by a company called Creative Engineering, founded by a man named Aaron Fechter. And the technical detail that mattered was the air. Most animatronics of that era ran on hydraulics, fluid under pressure. Fechter's ran on pneumatics, compressed air. And pneumatic movement is smoother and more precise, which meant these things could do small gestures. A shrug, a head tilt on a beat. Timing. If you've only ever seen photographs of 80s animatronics, they look like stiff nightmares. Go and watch footage of a Rockafire show, and it's genuinely impressive craft. The band plays in time. They interact with each other. The comedy has rhythm to it. Somebody sat down and choreographed all of that, frame by frame, on tape, and then it ran the same way several times a day for years. And it was a whole industry. Not a novelty, an industry. There's an estimate from a 1982 issue of Fortune putting the startup cost of an animatronic setup at around $90,000 for 8 characters, which in 1982 money is a serious capital investment for a pizza restaurant. People were doing that. Lots of people were doing that. There were chains all over the place, all with their own bands, all with their own mascots, because for about a decade everyone was convinced this was the future of family dining. Then the rivalry. Showbiz's competition was Pizza Time Theatre, the chain built around a rat in a boater hat. The two of them went at each other properly. Lawsuits, market saturation, the works, and neither of them made it out intact. They ended up merged because that was the only option left. The part that's never stopped bothering me is what happened to the robots themselves. After the merger, the Rockafire characters didn't get retired. They got converted. The physical robots, the same frames and the same mechanisms bolted to the same stages, were retrofitted and reprogrammed into the characters of the other chain. The gorilla became the purple one. The bear became the dog. The mouse became the girl. Same machine, new face, new voice, new name, performing a show for a company that had beaten the company it used to work for. That happened in real restaurants, in front of real children, in the early 90s. I don't need to draw the line to the games for you. Machines that used to be somebody else, still standing on the stage, wearing a different face. Nobody in this franchise had to invent that. It was a business decision made by adults with spreadsheets. Fechter, for what it's worth, is still about. He's kept a set of the originals running, he's got a YouTube channel, and the band has had a proper second life as a cult object. There's a 2008 documentary about the people who track these things down and restore them in their garages, which is its own gentle, slightly melancholy story about a technology that got left behind. Because that's what happened. The animatronic restaurant era just ended. The shows came down off the stages through the 90s and the 2000s, replaced by screens, because a screen costs nothing to maintain and never gets a stuck servo and never needs a bloke to come out and retune the air pressure. And that, I think, is the actual engine underneath this entire franchise. Not the murders, the obsolescence, because the reason a broken animatronic in a dark room works as a horror image isn't that robots are inherently frightening. It's that a specific generation of people have a genuine memory of these things, of the noise they made, the smell of the room, the slightly too loud audio, the way the eyes didn't quite track, and then that whole world quietly disappeared and nobody marked the occasion. The buildings got repurposed, the machines went into storage or skips or, in a fair number of cases, into the hands of enthusiasts. There are rock-afire units in barns in America right now, half restored, waiting for somebody with the time. That's a haunted house premise with no ghost required. The characters outlived their purpose and are still technically capable of performing. There's one more real-world parallel worth having, and it's the founding structure. Two rival animatronic pizza chains, run by different people with different design philosophies, competing, litigating, and eventually merging into one company that carried both legacies awkwardly under one name. And in the fiction, two men, one creative and one technical, whose partnership produces something that outlives both of them and behaves badly. The community has been drawing that line for years. The game theory lot went at it in some detail, tracing the corporate history of the real chains against the corporate history of the fictional one. And whether Cawthon was working from that consciously or simply absorbed the shape of it from having grown up near it, the fit is close enough to be interesting. Fun fact to close this half on, because I like it. Cawthon has mentioned getting in touch with people on the real side of this, reference material, photographs, the actual look of the machines and the rooms, which means somewhere in the production of a horror game about killer robots, there was a polite email exchange about what the inside of a 1984 pizza restaurant actually looked like. And since we're here, the restoration scene deserves a minute of its own, because it's one of the gentlest things attached to any of this. When the chains converted or closed, the machines had to go somewhere. Some got scrapped. A lot ended up in storage and then in auctions and then, eventually, in the hands of people who wanted them. Not collectors in the investment sense, hobbyists. People with a garage and a compressor and an enormous amount of patience. Because restoring one of these isn't like restoring a car. You're dealing with pneumatic lines that have perished, control systems that ran off tape, show programming stored on formats nobody supports anymore, and costume material that spent 30 years in a barn. And then, having got it moving again, you have to teach it to perform, because a working animatronic that isn't running a show is just a mannequin twitching. There's a place in rural Mississippi where a bloke has rebuilt an entire 80s dining room from scratch, the stage, the seating, the lot, and runs the full show in it. He's also got a 9-foot animatronic Elvis and an all-dog Beatles tribute band, which are both real things that really existed in restaurants, and which I did not know about until embarrassingly recently. He does children's parties in the daytime, and rather different parties for grown-ups in the evening, which feels like the correct use of the asset. And there's a documentary from 2008 about the whole subculture, made by a pair of filmmakers who went and found these people. It's affectionate rather than mocking, which is the right register, and it's worth an hour of your time if the idea of somebody spending years getting a mechanical gorilla to play a keyboard again appeals to you at all. What gets me about it is the motivation. Nobody's making money. There's no market to speak of. They're doing it because they were 7 years old in a room with these things, and something about it stuck, and now they're 50 and they've got a compressor. That's the sincere version of the same impulse the games are running on. The horror take is, the machine is still here and it shouldn't be. The restoration take is, the machine is still here and somebody should look after it. I think about those two readings sitting side by side quite a lot. Same object, same era, same slightly uncanny stage presence. One group made a franchise out of being unsettled by it. The other group made a hobby out of loving it. And they overlap more than you'd expect. A fair few restorers came to it through the games, and a fair few players went looking for real footage and never quite came back. Right, that's the world the games grew out of. Let's talk about the bloke who grew them. Cawthon ran his career off a personal website that looked like it was built in about 2003, and I mean that fondly. The pattern went like this. A game would come out. Some weeks or months later, the front page of that site would change to a single image, usually dark, usually with something half visible in it, usually with a bit of text that made no sense yet. No press release, no announcement, just a new picture on a web page, and the fan base would fall on it immediately. People would pull the image into editing software, crank the brightness, isolate the color channels, look for text hidden in the noise, and there frequently was text hidden in the noise, because he knew exactly what they were going to do, and he was writing for that behaviour. That's an ARG in everything but name, run by one bloke on a website with no design budget. For years. I think this is genuinely underrated as a reason the franchise got so big so fast. It wasn't just that the games were popular, it's that between the games, there was always something to do. The gap between releases became its own activity. You could be a FNAF fan on a Tuesday in March when nothing was out, because there was a picture to argue about. The other thing about his release habits is that he kept jumping the queue on himself. The fourth game was originally teased for Halloween, then it got moved to early August, then he finished it and put it out on the 23rd of July because it was done, and he saw no reason to sit on it. That happened repeatedly, dates announced and then beaten, which is such an unusual failure mode for the games industry that it barely registers as a problem. Everybody else is late, and this bloke kept being early. Except once, and this is the story I really want to tell you, because it's the one that tells you most about him. In January 2016, he released a FNAF World. It's a role-playing game. Turn-based battles, party members, an overworld to explore, and the entire cast rendered as cute little chibi versions of themselves. No horror at all, it's a bright, silly, affectionate thing, where Freddy and Bonnie wander around a colourful map fighting other robots. He'd been explicit that the main story was finished after the fourth game, and this was a spin-off, a bit of fun. It launched on Steam at $10, and it was not finished. Features missing, systems that didn't work, the general sense of a thing that had been shipped a month or two before. It was ready. And he'd done this to himself again by moving the date forward. The reaction was immediate, and he responded the same day with a post that said, more or less, that he'd been accused of rushing his games since the very first one, but this was the first time he'd actually agreed with it. That he'd got too eager to show off the parts that were finished and stopped paying attention to the parts that weren't. 4 days later, he pulled it from Steam entirely. And the game had a very positive rating. 87% it was selling. The public reception on the store page was, by any normal commercial standard, good, and he wrote that he wasn't satisfied with it regardless, that he was removing it, and that he'd arranged with Valve for anyone to get a full refund, regardless of how long they'd owned it or how much they'd played. Not the standard 2 hours and 2 weeks window. Anyone, any time. He then encouraged people to refund it, even if they'd enjoyed it, and said that when it was finished it would be free, permanently, and go up on GameJolt instead, which is exactly what happened a few weeks later. I've thought about that one a fair bit, and I still find it slightly startling. A developer with a hit franchise, an 87% rating, and money coming in, looked at his own product and decided the rating was wrong, and he'd rather have nothing. There's a version of that which is stubbornness, and a version which is integrity, and I suspect it's both at once, but either way, it's not a common instinct. The film took 8 years, and it's a saga. April 2015. Warner Bros. Announced they've got the rights, big producers attached. Gil Keenan, who'd made Monster House, a genuinely good animated horror film about a haunted building, comes on to direct and co-write. And then nothing happens for a very long time. By early 2017, Cawthon's saying publicly that it's back at square one, and that this time he intends to be involved from day one, which is a fairly clear signal about how the previous arrangement had gone. The rights moved to Blumhouse that March. Keenan steps away in May. In February 2018, Chris Columbus comes on to direct and write, which is a genuinely interesting choice for a horror film about children and an empty building. Cawthon writes a script with one of the novel co-authors, and then in November 2018 he throws it out. Not the studio. Him. He posted about it himself. He'd had a script written, Jason Blum liked it, Chris Columbus liked it, and he binned it because he'd had a different idea he preferred. He took responsibility for the delay and said it was his fault. Columbus departs in 2021. Emma Tammy comes on in October 2022. Filming happens in early 2023, in and around New Orleans, with the animatronic suits built by Jim Henson's Creature Shop. That was absolutely the correct call. They're practical, they're physically present on set, and they look right in a way no amount of rendering would have. It came out on the 27th of October, 2023, in cinemas and on streaming at the same time. The reviews were bad. Properly bad, the critical scores are down in the territory reserved for films nobody enjoyed making, and it made close to $300 million worldwide and became the highest-grossing film Blumhouse had ever released. Both of those things are true, and they are not in tension. That audience had been waiting 8 years and was not consulting a review aggregator. There's a sequel out in December 2025, which the critics liked even less, and which the audience turned up for anyway. Fun bit of nonsense from that era while we're here. In December 2023, an official FNAF Roblox game got released by accident in an unfinished state by its own developers. It was live long enough for people to play it and describe it before it got pulled. Cawthon called it a blunder, which, given the FNAF world story, does suggest a certain house tendency around release dates. Now the thing I've been circling. In June 2021, Scott Cawthon retired. What happened was that records of his political donations circulated, and there was significant backlash, particularly from LGBT people within the fan base. He responded on Reddit defending the donations and saying he'd supported candidates across parties over the years. The response to the response did not settle things, and a few days later, he posted on his website that he was stepping back. The post itself is mostly about the fans. He wrote that he'd had a blessed and fulfilling career, that he'd been shown great kindness and tried to show kindness in return, and that he'd watched the growth of what he called possibly the most creative and talented fan base on the planet. He said he'd still be around, just not in the capacity he had been, and that the franchise would continue under someone he chose and trusted. I'm going to leave it there, because this is a video about a pizza restaurant and you're trying to get to sleep, and because I don't think me weighing in adds anything useful to a disagreement that a lot of people have already had at length. That's what happened. It's part of the record. Different people in that fan base reached very different conclusions about it, and continue to, and both of those groups are still here making things. What it meant practically is that the franchise stopped being one man. Steel Wool Studios had already been the partner on the VR entries and went on to make most of the mainline games since. Megacat did the pixel art adaptation. Illumix made an augmented reality game where the animatronics turned up in your actual house via your phone camera, which ran for a few years before the servers went off in 2024. So it's a proper multi-studio operation now. with a story bible and continuity meetings, and presumably a shared spreadsheet somewhere with the timeline on it, which is a very long way from a man rendering stills in 3ds Max at his kitchen table. Two last things, and they're both about the audience, because you genuinely cannot tell this story without them. The first is theory culture. The Game Theorists channel had, by 2023, put out something north of 60 FNAF videos, with a combined view count in the region of 800 million. That's not a fandom. That's a broadcast institution built on top of somebody else's ambiguity, and it created a strange loop where the games got more cryptic, partly because there was an audience that had proved it would decode anything, and the decoding got more elaborate because the games kept rewarding it. Neither side could stop. The second is the fan games, and this one I find properly heartwarming. FNAF spawned thousands of imitators. Absolutely thousands. Game Jolt ended up categorizing FNAF-style projects as their own genre just to organize the volume. Most of them were made by teenagers with free software, and more enthusiasm than skill, which is exactly how it should be. And in 2020, Cawthon announced he was going to fund some of them. Not shut them down. Fund them. The Fazbear Fanverse initiative picked out a handful of the best-loved fan projects. One Night at Flumpty's, the 5 Nights at Candy's series, Pop Goes, The Joy of Creation, and put money and publishing behind them so they could come to consoles and mobile properly, with merchandise, a commercial horror franchise deciding to subsidize its own imitators. Turning the people who'd been making unofficial versions of your game into people making officially supported versions of their own games. That's a lovely thing to have done, and it's the note I'd rather leave this layer on than the difficult one. Whatever else is true about how this all went, somebody looked at a pile of unauthorized knockoffs made by kids and thought, right, let's pay for these. There's one more corner of this I want to wander into before we stop, and it's the stuff that isn't games at all. Start with the music, because the music is enormous, and a lot of people came in through it rather than through anything else. There's a song by an artist called The Living Tombstone, made in 2014, based on the first game. It went absolutely stratospheric, hundreds of millions of views, the sort of number that stops meaning anything. And a generation of kids knew that song years before they knew what the game was, which is a slightly odd cultural situation. The theme tune arrived before the show. 9 years later, it played over the closing credits of the film, which I think is genuinely the correct decision, and also quite a moving one, if you squint. An unofficial fan song, made by somebody with no involvement in anything, ends up as the official send-off in a universal picture. Not many franchises would do that. Most would commission something, and there's a whole ecosystem underneath it. Fan songs, animations, hour-long musical adaptations, an entire creative economy that ran in parallel to the games and occasionally outpaced them in reach. Then the merchandise, which is where the whole thing gets genuinely strange if you stop and look at it. Funko did the plushes and the vinyl figures. Todd McFarlane, the Spawn bloke, one of the biggest names in comics, did construction sets, buildable versions of the offices and the stages, with the characters posed in them. So you could build a room from the first game on your desk out of little plastic bricks. And you can find this stuff in the toy aisle of an ordinary shop. Not a specialist place, a supermarket. There are children walking around right now with a plush Freddy under one arm who have no idea about any of what we've talked about tonight and are perfectly happy. I don't think that's a criticism, incidentally. It's just remarkable. This is a horror property built on a subject about as grim as subjects get, and it has become, functionally, a character brand. Freddy is a shape now. He's a silhouette on a lunchbox. There's a version of this where that feels wrong, and I understand people who land there. But I keep coming back to the fact that most of the great children's monsters went the same way. Frankenstein's creature ended up on breakfast cereal. Then there are the odd little free things, which I've got a real soft spot for. In December 2019, a game appeared called Freddy in Space 2, a side-scrolling shooter, free in no way horror, built as a promotional tie-in for a charity live stream that the game theorists were running. So the franchise's biggest theorist channel ran a fundraiser, and Cawthon made them a whole game to go with it. Then in April 2021, Security Breach got delayed for the second time, and rather than just posting an apology, he released a free side-scrolling brawler called Fury's Rage, in which the new cast beat up waves of enemies in the streets. As compensation for a delay. I love that as a gesture. It's slightly ridiculous it took actual work, and the message is basically, sorry about the wait, here's something to be going on with, and it's kept going in that direction. There's a kart racer 5 laps at Freddy's, announced around the 10th anniversary, which is exactly where every long-running character franchise eventually arrives. You know a property has fully matured when the murderers get go-karts. In 2025, there was a Halloween Horror Nights attraction at Universal, based on the film, running on selected nights across the autumn, which means you could physically walk through a Freddy Fazbear's built at full scale with actors in it as an evening out. That's a proper distance travelled from a greenlight page. What I find quietly nice about all of this is how much of it wasn't planned. None of the merchandise strategy, none of the theory video economy, none of the music was designed at the start. There was no roadmap. A bloke made a small scary game about a room, and then a very large number of people decided independently to build things next to it, and the thing kept accreting, which is, when you think about it, the same process as the lore itself. Something got left lying around, and other people picked it up and made more of it, and nobody was in charge of the shape it ended up taking. So that's where we've got to. 8 layers, starting in a small office with a fan and a battery, and ending in a barn somewhere with a half-restored gorilla in it, waiting for somebody to have a free weekend. I want to go back to that room for a second, because we started there, and it's a decent place to finish. One person, a fairly ordinary piece of software, a set of pre-rendered images, and a criticism he decided to agree with rather than argue about. That's the seed of all of it. Every book, every film, every plush toy in every supermarket, every theory video, every kid in a homemade Freddy costume, every barn full of pneumatic robots that got a second look because a game made people curious again. None of that was the plan. There wasn't a plan. There was a bad review about a beaver, and most of what we've talked about tonight is other people's work. The timeline isn't in the games. People built it. The dates came off calendars in the background. The names came out of an activity book. Strangers, a lot of them quite young, spent a decade picking the pieces up and comparing notes. Which is why I think it's a good thing to listen to at this hour, honestly. There's no resolution waiting at the end of it. Nothing gets settled. Somebody will put something out next year, and a chunk of it will have to be rechecked, and the arguments will start again, and nobody will win those either. It's still in progress, genuinely, not in the marketing sense where there's another instalment coming. In the actual sense. There are questions in there that have been open since 2014 and might never close, because the one person who could have closed them chose not to, and then stepped away. I find that oddly restful rather than frustrating. There's nothing to finish. You can put it down mid-thought, and it'll be in exactly the same state when you come back. A few things I've got in mind for other videos, if you fancy more of this at some point. The phone calls on their own, line by line, because as I said, they're doing far more work than anyone gives them credit for. The fan game world properly. Candies and flumpties and all the rest, which is a whole parallel history most people never look at. And the real showbiz story at full length. The rise and the lawsuits and the retrofits and the people restoring them now, because that one stands up entirely on its own without a single ghost in it. None of that needs doing tonight. For now, though, the room, a desk, a fan that keeps turning, a chair that swivels left and right and nothing else, 2 doorways, a tablet, a number in the corner that only ever goes one direction, and 6 hours which always end, whether or not you did anything clever. 6 o'clock comes either way, it always did, night.